Late at night in a quiet town in North Carolina, officers Daniel Morris and Luke Watson pulled over a black woman driving a sleek SUV. What should have been a routine traffic stop quickly turned into something far more sinister, a carefully orchestrated setup. They accused her of running a stop sign that didn't exist and, within moments, escalated the situation, claiming they had reason to believe she was in possession of illegal substances. But what these officers didn't realize was that they had just targeted the wrong person. Nia Carter was not an ordinary civilian. She was a highly trained CIA operative, accustomed to high-stakes missions, deception, and survival under pressure. As the officers smirked and pretended to discover a suspicious bag in her trunk, Nia remained perfectly still, her mind racing, analyzing every detail. She knew this was a setup. She also knew how to play the long game. Instead of resisting, she complied, allowing the officers to handcuff her and place her in the back of their patrol car. But before they even pulled away, she had already triggered a distress signal embedded in her jacket, a silent beacon that would alert her team. At the precinct, Morris and Watson paraded their big catch in front of their colleagues, bragging about taking another so-called criminal off the streets. But one person wasn't convinced. Officer Ryan Keller, a rookie with an instinct for the truth, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He had seen many arrests, but something about this one felt too neat, too scripted. When he processed Nia's paperwork, he noticed something strange. Her employment history had gaps, redacted records that hinted at classified government work. His gut told him to dig deeper. Meanwhile, across town, a team of federal agents was already mobilizing. They had received Nia's distress call, and within hours, the small-town police station would be swarming with investigators. The arrival of the FBI sent shockwaves through the department. Officers exchanged nervous glances as agents pulled case files, accessed records, and reviewed past arrests. It didn't take long to uncover the truth. Morris and Watson had a long history of falsifying charges, planting evidence, and targeting vulnerable individuals. This time, however, they had gone too far. By morning, the once confident officers were in handcuffs, facing charges of corruption, falsifying reports, and abuse of power. Officer Keller, the only one willing to question his superiors, found himself at the center of the investigation, his actions helping to bring justice to light. As for Nia Carter, she walked out of the station unscathed, her mission complete. She had exposed a corrupt system from the inside, turning the officers' own game against them. This is a powerful reminder that truth always finds a way to surface, no matter how deep corruption runs. If you want to hear more gripping stories like this, where justice prevails and the powerful are held accountable, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story that will leave you speechless. The night was quiet in Raleigh, North Carolina. The hum of streetlights flickered above deserted sidewalks, and the occasional car sped down the empty roads. Inside her sleek black SUV, Nia Carter exhaled deeply, her fingers lightly drumming against the steering wheel. It had been a long day, filled with tension, calculated movements, and carefully chosen words. But now, as she cruised through the nearly empty streets, a sense of calm began to settle over her. She reached over to adjust the air conditioning, letting the cool air wash over her. The rhythmic hum of the engine and the gentle vibration of the road beneath her wheels provided a soothing contrast to the chaos she had navigated throughout the day. Her muscles, tight from hours of focus, began to relax. She rotated her shoulders slightly, easing the tension that had built up. Nia had spent the past few weeks deep undercover, working tirelessly to gather intelligence and ensure that her mission was completed flawlessly. Every interaction had been measured, every move scrutinized. She had remained composed under pressure, constantly aware of the risks that came with her role. Now, finally nearing the end of her assignment, she allowed herself a rare moment of peace. Reaching for the cup holder, she took a sip from the lukewarm coffee she had picked up earlier. It wasn't fresh, but the familiar bitterness was grounding. It reminded her of late nights spent in safe houses, reviewing mission details, or early mornings before a stakeout. Even in these moments of solitude, she remained connected to her purpose. A soft jazz melody played through her car's speakers, a playlist she had curated over the years, music that helped her transition between the intensity of her work and the moments in between. The slow, soothing notes filled the cabin, creating a quiet sanctuary in the midst of the darkened streets. She tapped her fingers lightly against the leather steering wheel, syncing with the rhythm, allowing herself to be present in this fleeting moment of relaxation. As she neared a quiet intersection, she slowed, her sharp eyes catching the faint glint of a reflective stop sign. Even in her moments of peace, her instincts remained sharp. Years of training had conditioned her to stay aware of her surroundings, to process details even when she wasn't actively on alert. She came to a full stop, her hands steady on the wheel, before making the turn. Though the night felt still, Nia knew that stillness was often deceptive. The world she operated in was rarely ever silent, and moments like these were precious. As she continued down the empty road, she took another deep breath, savoring the last few minutes of quiet before the next phase of her journey began. The tranquility of the night was shattered in an instant. Nia had been savoring the quiet, the rhythmic hum of her SUV's engine a steady companion as she navigated the empty streets of Raleigh. The night had been hers, a rare moment of solitude after weeks of tense, calculated work. She had allowed herself to slip into a rare state of relaxation, the soothing jazz notes from her playlist lulling her into a momentary escape. But peace, as always, was fleeting. A sudden burst of flashing blue and red lights flooded the inside of her car, bouncing harshly off the rearview mirror and casting jagged shadows across the dashboard. The once gentle night was now fractured by the shrill wail of a police siren cutting through the air. The contrast was jarring. 1 second, she had been immersed in stillness, and the next, she was thrust back into high alert. Her muscles tensed instinctively, though her expression remained unreadable. This wasn't panic, it was control. Her heart rate stayed steady, her breathing measured. Nia Carter was no ordinary woman. She had been trained for moments like this, trained to face pressure without giving in to fear. Her mind sharpened, quickly assessing the situation with the efficiency of someone who had spent years navigating dangerous territory. Keeping her movements deliberate and calm, she guided her car toward the curb, the tires rolling onto the gravel with a quiet crunch. She turned off the engine, the purr of the motor fading into the background, and reached for the glove compartment. Her fingers brushed against the cool surface of her license and registration, retrieving them smoothly. In her rearview mirror, she watched as the police vehicle came to a halt just behind her. Its headlights remained on, beaming intensely, flooding her SUV with light, as if she were on a stage under an interrogation lamp. The flashing emergency lights continued their relentless pattern, creating an eerie pulse against the darkened street. Then, 2 figures emerged from the patrol car. Their movements were slow but deliberate, exuding the kind of forced authority she had seen many times before. The first officer, the driver, was tall with a rigid stance, his square jaw set in a stern expression as he advanced toward her window. He had the air of someone who expected compliance, his every step exuding control. His uniform was crisp, the navy blue fabric catching the glow of the streetlights, his badge reflecting a sharp glint of silver. The second officer, slightly shorter and stockier, moved behind him with a calculated presence. His build was more compact, but his posture mirrored his partner's, a deliberate show of dominance. His eyes, sharp and observant, flicked toward her SUV, scanning it with scrutiny, as if already searching for something incriminating. Nia took in every detail without shifting her gaze too obviously. Years of experience had taught her that the smallest observations could mean the difference between control and chaos. The way the second officer's hand hovered near his utility belt, the subtle tension in the first officer's jaw, these were all signals, pieces of an unspoken narrative unfolding before her. She kept her hands where they could see them, holding her license and registration at the ready. She had no intention of making their job easier, but she also knew that unnecessary escalation would be counterproductive. The goal was to maintain control, not just of the situation but of the way it played out. The first officer stopped just beside her window, leaning slightly as he peered inside. His flashlight flickered on, the beam sweeping across the interior of her vehicle before landing squarely on her face. The brightness forced her pupils to constrict, but she refused to flinch. Instead, she met his gaze head-on, her expression neutral but unwavering. "Good evening, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a practiced authority. Nia tilted her head slightly, her tone cool and even. "Evening, officer." The second officer took a step closer, standing just behind his partner, his presence looming. The silence stretched for a second too long before the first officer continued. "You know why we pulled you over tonight?" She kept her tone calm, measured. "No, officer. I wasn't speeding, and I made a full stop at the intersection." A small smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, condescending in its subtlety. "Actually," he said, drawing out the word, "you failed to stop at that sign back there. That's a moving violation." Nia held her ground, her expression unwavering. She knew she had stopped. She had trained her eyes on that reflective sign, taken a deliberate pause before turning. But this wasn't about traffic laws, this was something else. "I'm certain I stopped," she said firmly but without aggression. "Perhaps you're mistaken." The officer's smirk deepened, his grip on the flashlight tightening slightly. It was a game to him, a script he had played out before, one he expected her to follow. But she wasn't playing. "License and registration," he interrupted, his voice hardening. Without hesitation, she handed them over, her movements deliberate and slow. Her fingers brushed his for the briefest moment as he took them, his eyes narrowing slightly as he scanned her information. "North Carolina plates," he muttered under his breath, almost as if talking to himself. Then louder, "You live around here?" "Yes, officer," she replied smoothly, her patience unwavering. A voice from the rear of her vehicle broke the exchange. "Hey, Morris, you might want to take a look back here." The second officer's voice carried a note of forced casualness, but there was an underlying tone of anticipation that didn't sit right with her. Nia watched in her side mirror as the taller officer, Morris, now identified, straightened, passing her documents back without another word. "Stay in the car," he ordered before turning on his heel to join his partner at the trunk of her SUV. Her jaw tightened slightly, but she remained still. She observed through the mirror as they huddled near the back of her vehicle, their heads tilted in low conversation. The second officer pointed at something, his expression unreadable. Morris nodded, exchanging a glance with his partner, something unsaid but clear passing between them. A flicker of unease crawled up her spine, not fear, never fear, but an instinctual warning. She had been in situations like this before, different settings, different uniforms, but the same manipulative tactics. Morris returned to her window, his expression having shifted from practiced politeness to something more serious, almost grim. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," he ordered, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. Nia didn't move immediately. She tilted her head slightly, her voice cool but questioning. "May I ask why, officer?" His lips pressed into a thin line. "We have reason to believe you're in possession of illegal substances." She didn't react outwardly, but inside, her mind worked rapidly. Illegal substances. That was their angle. Something had just been set in motion. A setup. A test of control. A game she wasn't about to lose. As she reached for the door handle, her muscles relaxed in an almost imperceptible way, not in surrender, but in preparation. They had no idea who they were dealing with. And soon, they would regret ever pulling her over. Hundreds of miles away, in a secure, windowless operations center in Langley, Virginia, a soft but urgent chime echoed through the dimly lit room. The sound was barely perceptible, lost amid the constant hum of high-tech equipment and quiet conversations. But for the agents monitoring the incoming alerts, it was the only thing that mattered at that moment. A blinking red dot appeared on the central screen, pulsing with quiet insistence. Agent Nia Carter, emergency beacon activated. The room, once filled with the quiet but methodical movement of intelligence analysts and field operatives, shifted instantly into high alert. A senior agent, Liam Henderson, immediately strode to the front of the operations center, his sharp eyes locking onto the data streaming across the monitors. His heart rate remained steady, but his mind was already racing through the necessary steps. "She's in trouble," he murmured under his breath before speaking louder. "Get me all satellite feeds of Raleigh, North Carolina, within a 3-mile radius of that signal. I want local police logs, radio chatter, and any ongoing dispatch reports now." Around him, agents and analysts sprang into action. Keyboards clattered, phones rang, and screens filled with rapidly updating information. A junior analyst, Sarah Whitman, pulled up surveillance footage from traffic and security cameras within the area. Within seconds, they had a live feed of Nia's last known location. "She's been pulled over," Sarah announced, her voice clipped but controlled. "2 officers on the scene, Raleigh PD. They have her out of the vehicle." Liam narrowed his eyes at the grainy feed. The posture of the officers, the way they crowded near her trunk, the way one of them smirked, it didn't look like a routine stop. "Facial recognition," Liam ordered. "Run those officers through the system. I want their full histories, disciplinary records, and known associations." Another agent, Eric Lawson, was already on it. Within moments, the system flagged both men, Officer Daniel Morris and Officer Luke Watson. A brief summary of their records appeared on the screen, and what Liam saw made his jaw tighten. "These guys have a pattern," Eric muttered. "Multiple arrests under questionable circumstances. Almost all their charges involve discovered contraband. And get this, 90% of their suspects are people of color." A muscle in Liam's jaw twitched. "They're dirty. They think they just got another easy target." He glanced back at the pulsing red dot on the screen, still transmitting from Nia's location. Except this time, they picked the wrong person. He turned to another agent, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Activate the extraction team. I want a team of 4 in Raleigh within the hour." She nodded. "Already ahead of you. Our nearest field operatives are 30 minutes out. We'll have them in position before this situation escalates." Liam exhaled sharply. He knew Nia, he had worked with her for years. She was one of their best, a seasoned operative who could handle almost any situation. But she was also smart enough to know when to call for backup. If she had activated her emergency beacon, it meant she wasn't taking any chances. And neither would they. 30 minutes later, a sleek black SUV rolled to a stop in a secluded parking lot just a few blocks from Nia's last known location. Inside, 4 CIA field operatives sat in silence, each checking their weapons and communication devices with quiet efficiency. Leading the team was Agent Marcus Reed, a veteran operative with years of experience in high-risk extractions. His dark eyes scanned the area before he gave a single nod. "Let's move," he ordered. The team exited the vehicle, blending seamlessly into the shadows. They had already tapped into the Raleigh PD radio frequency, listening in on every dispatch call. From what they could tell, the situation at the police station was still contained. Nia had been taken in for questioning, but she hadn't been officially processed yet. That meant they still had time. Marcus pressed a finger to his earpiece. "Command, we're in position. What's the latest?" Liam's voice came through, steady and sharp. "Nia's being held in a back interrogation room. They haven't booked her yet, which means they're stalling. Likely trying to pressure her or plant more evidence." Marcus smirked. "That's cute. They really have no idea who they're dealing with." "We need to be smart about this," Liam cautioned. "We can't just storm a police station. Make sure we have eyes inside before we move." The team split up. One of the operatives, Agent Valerie Chen, slipped into the station under the guise of a public defender, flashing a fake ID that would pass any casual scrutiny. Meanwhile, Agent Jamal Torres hacked into the station's security system from a remote location, pulling up live footage of the building's interior. Valerie entered the lobby, moving with purpose but without drawing attention. She quickly spotted Nia through the glass window of an interrogation room. She looked calm, but Valerie knew better. Nia was simply waiting. Observing. Preparing for the inevitable. The two officers, Morris and Watson, stood nearby, laughing with another officer at the front desk. Valerie's voice was soft but firm as she spoke into her hidden earpiece. Visual on Nia. "Officers are relaxed, too relaxed. They think they have the upper hand." Marcus grinned. "Let's change that." Jamal's voice crackled through the comms. "I just disabled the station's external security feeds. They won't see us coming." "Good," Marcus replied. "Valerie, get ready to extract Nia. Jamal, trigger the fire alarm, let's cause some chaos." Seconds later, the blaring sound of an alarm filled the station. Officers jumped, exchanging confused glances. Red warning lights flashed along the walls as a voice over the PA system ordered an evacuation. Inside the interrogation room, Nia finally moved. She stood up, her posture shifting from passive to assertive. Morris scowled. "Stay where you are." Nia smiled. "I don't think so." The door burst open, and Valerie stepped inside. "Miss Carter, you're coming with me." Before Morris or Watson could react, Marcus and the rest of the team entered through the emergency exit, their presence overwhelming. The corrupt officers' faces paled as they registered the situation. This wasn't just a routine. "Ned," to Valerie, a smirk playing on her lips. "Took you long enough." Valerie chuckled. "You looked like you had it under control." As the team escorted Nia out of the station, Liam's voice came through the comms. "We're handling the legal side. The evidence against those officers is already being processed. You're clear." Outside, the night air was cool against Nia's skin as she climbed into the waiting SUV. Marcus turned to her. "You good?" Nia exhaled, her smirk never fading. "Better than ever." As the vehicle pulled away, sirens blared behind them, not for her, but for the men who had tried to take her down. They had chosen the wrong woman. And now, they were about to pay the price. The walls of the Raleigh Police Department were closing in on officers Daniel Morris and Luke Watson, though they didn't know it yet. For years, they had operated without fear, planting evidence, falsifying reports, and targeting individuals they assumed could never fight back. They had built their careers on deception, intimidation, and manipulation. But this time, they had picked the wrong target. Their downfall began the moment they pulled over Nia Carter. The next morning, Morris arrived at the station feeling unsettled. The events of the previous night played on a loop in his mind, the woman's unwavering calm, the sudden chaos caused by the fire alarm, and, most of all, the men who had walked in with silent authority, dismantling their false sense of control in an instant. Something wasn't right. He had assumed that, like many others before her, Nia Carter would panic, plead, or break under pressure. Instead, she had acted like she was in charge. And then, just like that, she was gone, leaving behind an uncomfortable silence in the precinct. Watson walked in moments later, sipping a coffee, his usual arrogance intact. "Hell of a night, huh?" he said, dropping into his chair with a smirk. "I told you she was hiding something." Morris nodded absently, flipping through his desk drawer. He had a habit of keeping notes, scribbled details about his arrests, reminders about his fabricated reports. But as he leafed through the papers, his fingers went still. His arrest report on Carter was missing. What the hell? Morris muttered under his breath, scanning the desk. His heart rate spiked. It had been there last night, he was sure of it. Watson frowned. "What's wrong?" Morris exhaled sharply. "My notes on the Carter case. They're gone." Watson chuckled. "Relax. Maybe someone moved them." But Morris couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The missing report wasn't just a misplaced piece of paper, it was a sign that the situation was slipping out of their control. Then, as if on cue, Captain Harris, the precinct commander, stepped out of his office, his face unreadable. "Morris, Watson. My office. Now." The entire room fell silent. Morris and Watson exchanged a glance before standing and walking toward the office, their usual confidence starting to waver. Inside the captain's office, the air was heavy. The blinds were partially drawn, casting streaks of sunlight across the desk. Captain Harris folded his arms, his expression hard. "Sit," he ordered. Morris hesitated before lowering himself into the chair. Watson followed, his smirk fading slightly. The captain slid a file across the desk toward them. Morris felt a chill creep up his spine as he recognized it. It was the very report he had been looking for. Only now, it was accompanied by several other documents, each stamped with a bold red Internal Affairs Review notice. "What is this?" Watson asked, his voice laced with forced bravado. The captain didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned forward, locking eyes with them. "Do you have any idea who you pulled over last night?" Morris clenched his jaw. "She was just another suspect." "Wrong." The captain's voice was sharp. "That woman wasn't just another suspect. She was a federal agent. A CIA operative. And thanks to your little stunt, Internal Affairs and the Department of Justice are breathing down my neck." Silence. Watson's face drained of color. "You're joking." "Do I look like I'm joking?" Harris snapped. "You two have been under review for months, but this? This was the final nail in the coffin." Morris's throat went dry. He had thought this would be just another easy case, another notch on his belt. But now, his career, his entire life, was unraveling in real time. "I need you to tell me the truth," the captain continued. "Did you plant evidence on her?" Morris's mind raced, calculating. Lying would be useless now. The department was already investigating, and if Internal Affairs was involved, it meant the FBI was likely looking into it too. Watson swallowed hard. We thought she was dirty," he stammered. "We just needed a reason to search the vehicle." Captain Harris shook his head in disgust. "So you fabricated one?" Neither man responded. Harris sighed, rubbing his temples before fixing them with a final, piercing glare. Effective immediately, you are both suspended pending a full investigation. Hand over your badges and weapons. Morris's blood ran cold. Watson sputtered, his hands tightening into fists. Captain, you can't be serious. Now. Reluctantly, both men reached for their belts, unfastening their holsters. Morris hesitated as he pulled the badge from his chest, the weight of it suddenly unbearable. He placed it on the desk with a quiet clink. Watson did the same, his hands shaking. You're dismissed, Harris said coldly. As they walked out of the office, all eyes in the precinct were on them. No more smirks. No more superiority. Just silence and judgment. For the first time, Morris felt what it was like to be on the other side of the power dynamic he had exploited for years. And he didn't like it. Days later, the headlines broke. Raleigh officers under investigation for falsifying evidence against federal agent. Corrupt cops exposed, decade of wrongful arrests under scrutiny. The world they had carefully constructed, the power they had abused, was collapsing. Morris sat alone in his apartment, staring at the screen, his phone buzzing non-stop with calls from former colleagues, lawyers, and reporters. He ignored them all. His career was over. Watson, on the other hand, hadn't accepted reality yet. He paced his living room, ranting to himself, clinging to the belief that somehow, this would all blow over. But it wouldn't. The FBI's involvement meant that there would be real consequences. Investigators were already reopening old cases, questioning past suspects, and gathering testimonies from individuals who had been falsely arrested. It wasn't long before lawsuits began rolling in. Families of victims they had wrongfully charged were demanding justice. The Raleigh PD, eager to distance itself from the scandal, offered settlements and cooperation in exchange for reduced liability. Morris and Watson. They were on their own. And then, the final blow came, criminal charges. The Department of Justice formally charged them with civil rights violations, falsification of records, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. The penalties were severe. If convicted, they faced years in federal prison. Reality hit Watson like a freight train. He sat in his lawyer's office, his hands gripping the edges of his chair. There's got to be a way out of this, he muttered. The lawyer sighed, flipping through the stack of evidence. Not with what they have on you. Your best option is a plea deal. Morris, seated beside him, felt his stomach churn. A plea deal meant admitting guilt. It meant losing everything. But deep down, he knew, he had already lost it all. Months later, in a sterile courtroom, Morris and Watson stood before a federal judge. Their once pristine uniforms were replaced with orange jumpsuits, their hands cuffed, their futures sealed. The judge's voice rang clear through the courtroom. You abused your power, violated the trust placed in you, and destroyed lives in the process. And now, you will face the full weight of justice. A gavel struck. The sentence was handed down. 15 years each. As they were escorted away, the last thing Morris and Watson saw were the faces of the people they had wronged, watching, waiting, finally seeing justice served. For the first time, the law they had twisted for so long had turned against them. And this time, there was no escaping the consequences. The courthouse doors closed with a resounding thud, sealing the fate of officers Daniel Morris and Luke Watson. Nia Carter stood at a distance, watching as the convicted men were escorted away in handcuffs, their once arrogant demeanor replaced with a hollow, defeated look. Justice had been served. The system they had manipulated for years had finally turned against them. But for Nia, this was not the end, just another mission completed. She exhaled deeply, adjusting the strap of her leather satchel as she turned away from the courthouse steps. The case had gained national attention, shaking the Raleigh Police Department to its core, forcing internal reform, and exposing the corruption that had existed beneath the surface for years. Yet, Nia had no interest in the spotlight. The news media had tried to track her down for interviews, eager to put a face to the woman who had brought down 2 corrupt officers, but she had no desire for fame. She had a job to do. By the time she arrived at Langley, Virginia, the headquarters of the CIA, it was as if the entire ordeal had been neatly filed away in the past. The agency had already moved on to new missions, new threats, and new objectives. There was no ceremony, no applause for what she had done, only a subtle nod from her superiors, an acknowledgement that she had handled herself well in the field. And that was all she needed. She walked briskly through the familiar halls, the polished floors reflecting the overhead lights. Analysts moved with purpose, discussing intelligence reports and classified operations, while agents prepped for their next assignments. It was a world that never stopped, where moments of quiet reflection were rare and the stakes were always high. Inside her office, she sat at her desk, taking a moment to gather herself. A stack of folders awaited her, cases involving national security threats, espionage, and covert operations overseas. Compared to the situation with Morris and Watson, these cases carried far greater consequences, affecting not just individuals, but entire nations. Yet, what had happened in Raleigh lingered in her mind. It wasn't the high-level operations or international espionage that had nearly cost her freedom, it was the simple abuse of power by men who had believed they were untouchable. And that was the part that disturbed her the most. It was a reminder that corruption wasn't always hidden in deep underground networks or encrypted government files. Sometimes, it was in the uniformed officers patrolling the streets. Sometimes, it was in the places people trusted the most. Nia had spent years dismantling criminal organizations, infiltrating dangerous groups, and gathering intelligence to prevent international disasters. But what had happened to her in Raleigh reminded her that injustice wasn't always orchestrated by warlords or terrorists. Sometimes, it was carried out in the most ordinary of places, against everyday people who had no agency, no backup, and no voice. She had been fortunate, her training, her experience, and her agency had protected her. But how many others had been in her position without the resources to fight back? The thought settled heavily in her chest. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers tracing the edge of a case file, though her mind was elsewhere. The case against Morris and Watson had exposed a harsh reality: power, when placed in the wrong hands, could be a weapon of destruction. The 2 officers had spent years profiling, arresting, and charging innocent people, fabricating crimes, and ruining lives without consequence. They had acted with impunity, believing the system would always protect them. Until it didn't. What happened to her had only been a fraction of what others had likely endured. And while those officers were now paying the price for their actions, it wasn't lost on her that they were just 2 men in a much larger system. There would always be more. The fight wasn't over. But Nia wasn't the type to dwell in anger. She had learned long ago that justice wasn't about vengeance, it was about accountability. It was about ensuring that people like Morris and Watson never had the chance to do it again. She thought of Ryan Keller, the rookie officer who had listened to his instincts and chosen to stand for what was right. He had been the one to break the cycle, to question what others had blindly accepted. That gave her hope. There would always be people who abused their power. But there would also always be people willing to stand against them. And that was enough to keep going. A sharp knock on her office door pulled her from her thoughts. She straightened, pushing the case file aside as Liam Henderson, her CIA superior, stepped inside. "Back in the game already?" he asked, arching an eyebrow. Nia smirked. You know me. No rest for the wicked. Liam chuckled, taking a seat across from her desk. We have a situation, he said, his tone shifting into business mode. He slid a file across the desk. Covert operations in Eastern Europe. We need an extraction, and I need my best on it. She flipped open the file, scanning the contents. Another high-risk mission. Another opportunity to protect people who had no one else looking out for them. Do I even get a week off? She teased. Liam smirked. You'd be bored by day 3. He wasn't wrong. She closed the file and nodded. I'll take it. As Nia packed up her desk and prepared to head out for yet another mission, she reflected on everything that had happened. There was no clear-cut victory in cases like these. The world was complicated, and the line between justice and corruption was sometimes razor-thin. But she had learned that the truth always finds a way to the surface. And she wanted you, the viewers and readers, to take something from this story. The world isn't just shaped by the actions of those in power, it's shaped by the actions of ordinary people who choose to speak up. People like Ryan Keller, who refused to look the other way. People like the innocent men and women who had suffered but still sought justice. And people like you, who have the power to demand change. So if there's one thing to take away from all of this, let it be this: never stop questioning. Never stop fighting for what's right. And never let those in power convince you that your voice doesn't matter, because it does. Nia Carter's mission wasn't over. And neither is ours. Thank you for following this story. If you found it powerful, if it resonated with you, make sure to stay tuned, because there are always more stories that need to be told. Until next time.